The certified letter shook in my hands as I read the words that would change everything. Immediate removal of excess vehicles required within 48 hours or face legal action. I looked up from the paper to see Karen standing on my driveway, clipboard in hand, that smug smile spreading across her face like she had just won the lottery. 5 cars is excessive for any reasonable homeowner, she said, tapping her pen against the violation notice. The HOA board voted unanimously. You have no choice but to comply. I stood there in my own driveway, on my own property, being told what I could and could not do by a woman who had moved into the neighborhood just 2 years ago. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea what she had just started. That was the moment I realized I needed to make a phone call that would destroy everything she thought she knew about power. Because Karen had just threatened the wrong person. She had just threatened someone who owned every single house she claimed to represent. My name is David, and I have always been the type of person who values peace and quiet above almost everything else. After building a successful consulting business over the past 15 years, I finally had the resources to pursue my true passion. Classic cars. Beautiful, restored vintage automobiles that told stories of American craftsmanship and engineering excellence. My suburban home sits on a large lot with a spacious 3-car garage that I had converted into a proper workshop. The extended area gave me room for 5 vehicles. A 1967 Mustang Fastback in pristine condition. A 1970 Chevelle SS that I had restored from the ground up. A 1963 Corvette split window that was my pride and joy. A 1969 Camaro Z28 that purred like a lion. And finally, a 1965 Ford Thunderbird that belonged to my late grandfather. These cars were not just vehicles. They were pieces of history. They were investments. They were my connection to family memories and American automotive heritage. Every weekend, I would spend hours in that garage, polishing chrome, checking fluids, and maintaining these mechanical masterpieces. The neighborhood had always been quiet and peaceful. Most of my neighbors were professionals like myself. We minded our own business, kept our properties well maintained, and respected each other's privacy. The HOA had existed for years but operated with a light touch. Quarterly meetings, basic maintenance standards, nothing too invasive or controlling. That changed when Karen moved in. Karen arrived 2 years ago with her husband and immediately inserted herself into every aspect of community life. She attended every HOA meeting, volunteered for every committee, and seemed to have an opinion about everything happening in the neighborhood. Within 6 months, she had maneuvered herself into the position of HOA president through a combination of persistence and the general apathy of other residents who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, there were new rules about lawn maintenance schedules, approved paint colors, and acceptable outdoor decorations. Karen began conducting regular compliance inspections around the neighborhood, armed with her clipboard and measuring tape, looking for violations like a detective searching for clues. I had managed to avoid her attention for over a year by keeping my property immaculate and staying out of community politics. My cars were stored inside my garage, out of sight, and completely legal according to every city ordinance and the original HOA bylaws. I thought I was safe from her expanding web of control and micromanagement. I was wrong. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working in my home office. I opened the door to find Karen standing there with her usual clipboard and a stern expression that suggested she was about to deliver bad news. She was a woman in her early 50s with short blonde hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good afternoon, David," she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping onto my front porch. "I need to conduct an inspection of your garage area. We have received complaints about excessive vehicle storage on your property." I was confused and slightly annoyed by her presumptuous attitude. Complaints from whom? My cars are parked in my own garage on my own property. What possible violation could there be? Karen consulted her clipboard with the theatrical precision of someone who enjoyed wielding authority. According to HOA Regulation 47B, which was recently updated and approved by the board, no single residential property may store more than 2 vehicles in garage spaces. You currently have 5 vehicles, which constitutes a clear violation of community standards. I stared at her in disbelief. That regulation was never part of the original HOA agreement. When was this supposed update approved, and why was I not notified of any vote or community meeting? Her smile became even more condescending. The HOA board has the authority to update regulations as needed to maintain community standards. Your compliance is not optional. You have 48 hours to remove 3 vehicles from your property, or the HOA will begin fining procedures and potential legal action. She handed me a formal violation notice printed on official HOA letterhead. The document was detailed, professional, and completely unreasonable. As I read through the legal language, Karen stood there watching me with the satisfaction of someone who believed they held all the power in this situation. "This is ridiculous," I said, looking up from the notice. "These cars are my hobby and my investment. They are properly stored, legally registered, and completely within my rights as a property owner." Karen shook her head with mock sympathy. "Your rights end where community standards begin. The HOA exists to protect property values and maintain the character of our neighborhood. Excessive vehicle storage creates an unsightly situation that affects everyone." She turned to leave, then paused at the edge of my porch. "48 hours, David. After that, you will be facing significant fines and potential legal action. I suggest you start making arrangements to remove those excess vehicles immediately." I watched her walk back to her car, climbing into her pristine white SUV with the confidence of someone who had just won a major victory. As she drove away, I stood there holding the violation notice, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief at what had just happened. That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by my 5 beautiful classic cars, reading through the violation notice again and again. Karen had no idea what she had just started. She had no idea who she was dealing with. And she certainly had no idea that her days of wielding power over this community were numbered. I spent the entire night at my computer, diving deep into HOA bylaws, community regulations, and property law. The violation notice sat next to my keyboard like a challenge that demanded answers. Coffee grew cold in my mug as I scrolled through pages of legal documents, searching for any mention of vehicle storage limitations. The original HOA agreement from when the community was first developed contained no such restriction. Vehicle storage was governed by city ordinances, which I was clearly following. My cars were registered, insured, and stored on private property in an enclosed garage. There was absolutely nothing illegal or improper about my situation. The supposed Regulation 47B that Karen had cited was nowhere to be found in any official HOA documentation. I searched through meeting minutes, board resolutions, and community notifications going back 3 years. No vote had been taken. No community input had been solicited. No proper notification had been given to residents about any new vehicle storage restrictions. Karen had simply made up a rule and enforced it as if it were legitimate law. By morning, I had printed out dozens of pages of documentation proving that her violation notice was completely invalid. I felt confident that a simple phone call would resolve this misunderstanding and put an end to her overreach. I was about to learn just how wrong I could be. I called Corinne at 9 o'clock sharp, expecting a professional conversation between reasonable adults. Instead, I got a woman who seemed to have prepared for battle. "Corinne, this is David. I have reviewed the violation notice you gave me yesterday, and I need to discuss some concerns about the validity of this regulation." Her voice was cold and dismissive. "There is nothing to discuss. The regulation is valid and your compliance is required. Have you begun making arrangements to remove the excess vehicles?" I took a deep breath, trying to maintain a calm and professional tone. "I have researched the HOA bylaws extensively, and there is no record of any vote or community meeting that established this vehicle storage restriction. I believe there has been a mistake." Corinne's laugh was sharp and condescending. "Are you questioning the authority of the HOA board? Are you suggesting that we are operating outside our legal mandate?" "I am suggesting that proper procedures were not followed," I replied. "I am willing to work with you to find a reasonable solution, but I need to see documentation that this regulation was properly established according to HOA bylaws." The line went quiet for several seconds. When Corinne spoke again, her voice had shifted to a tone of barely controlled anger. "You have 48 hours to comply with the violation notice. If you choose to be difficult and non-compliant, the HOA will take whatever legal action is necessary to enforce community standards. This conversation is over." She hung up before I could respond. Within hours, I began hearing from neighbors about conversations they had had with Corinne. She was conducting what could only be described as a campaign of rumors and misinformation. According to multiple sources, she was telling people that I was refusing to follow HOA rules and causing problems for the entire community. Mrs. Peterson from across the street called to ask if I was really planning to turn my property into some kind of commercial auto storage facility. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson from 2 houses down stopped by to express their concern about precedent setting and property values. Corinne was actively poisoning the well, turning neighbors against me before I even had a chance to present my side of the story. She was using her position as HOA president to create a narrative that painted me as the villain in a situation where I was clearly the victim of her unauthorized rulemaking. That afternoon, I decided to visit the HOA office to review official documents and meeting minutes in person. The small office was located in a strip mall about 2 miles from our neighborhood, and it was staffed by a part-time administrator who seemed genuinely confused by my questions. "I need to review the official documentation for Regulation 47B regarding vehicle storage limitations," I told the administrator. She searched through filing cabinets and computer records for nearly an hour before admitting that she could find no such regulation. She showed me the most recent board meeting minutes, which contained no mention of vehicle storage discussions or votes. "This is strange," she said, looking genuinely puzzled. "Mrs. Corinne submitted this violation notice yesterday, but I cannot find any supporting documentation in our files." I asked her to print copies of the most recent board resolutions and meeting minutes. As I reviewed the documents, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Corinne had been making unilateral decisions and presenting them as official board actions. She was operating as if she had dictatorial authority over the entire community. The administrator leaned across the desk and lowered her voice. Between you and me, I have been getting a lot of complaints about HOA enforcement lately. People are saying that the rules keep changing without proper notification or community input. I left the HOA office with a folder full of documentation and a growing understanding that Corinne's abuse of power extended far beyond my situation. She had been bullying residents, making up rules, and using her position to settle personal grudges and impose her will on an entire community. That evening, I sat in my garage surrounded by my classic cars, realizing that this was no longer just about vehicle storage. This was about standing up to a tyrant who had hijacked our community and was using fabricated authority to harass and intimidate residents. Corinne had picked the wrong fight with the wrong person. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse with a determination that surprised even me. Corinne's violation notice had awakened something in me that I had not felt in years, a sense of justice, a need to fight back against corruption and abuse of power. She had turned this into a war, and I was going to fight it properly. The courthouse records office was a sterile, fluorescent-lit room filled with filing cabinets and computer terminals. I spent the first hour learning how to navigate the property record system, searching for information about our community's development history and current ownership structure. What I found made my blood run cold. The HOA board elections from the previous year had been conducted improperly. According to the official bylaws, board positions required a community-wide vote with proper notification and quorum requirements. Corinne's appointment as president had been done through a closed-door meeting with only 3 residents present, none of whom actually lived in the affected community anymore. She had essentially appointed herself to a position of authority that she had no legal right to hold. I printed out the election bylaws and voting records, adding them to my growing collection of evidence. But the deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Corinne was not just making up rules. She was operating an entirely illegitimate organization. My phone rang as I was leaving the courthouse. The caller ID showed a number I did not recognize. "Is this David?" The voice was elderly and nervous. "My name is Robert Chen. I live on Maple Street. I heard that you are having problems with Corinne and the HOA." I pulled over to take the call properly. "Yes, that is correct. How did you hear about my situation?" Robert's voice was filled with frustration and relief. "Corinne has been harassing me for months about my garden. She says my vegetables are not approved landscaping and that I need to remove them or face fines. I have been gardening for 40 years and no one has ever complained before." This was exactly what I had suspected. Corinne was targeting multiple residents with her fabricated authority. "Would you be willing to meet and discuss this? I believe we may be able to help each other." Over the next week, I had similar conversations with 6 other residents. Each had a story of harassment, intimidation, and unreasonable demands from Corinne. Mrs. Williams had been threatened with fines for her bird feeders. The Martinez family had been ordered to remove their children's play equipment because it was not aesthetically appropriate. Mr. Thompson had been told that his American flag was improperly displayed and needed to be relocated. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Corinne was using her fabricated authority to impose her personal preferences on the entire community, backed by threats of legal action and financial penalties. We began meeting secretly at a local coffee shop, sharing our experiences and documenting the scope of Corinne's abuse. Each person brought violation notices, threatening letters, and records of hostile encounters. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. But the most shocking discovery came from Mrs. Williams, who had been keeping detailed records of her interactions with Karen. She had noticed discrepancies in the HOA financial reports and had been quietly investigating the community's budget. "I think she has been stealing money," Mrs. Williams said, sliding a folder across the coffee shop table. "The monthly fees we pay are supposed to go toward community maintenance and improvements, but look at these expenditures." The documents showed thousands of dollars in HOA funds being spent on items that had no apparent community benefit: professional landscaping for individual properties, high-end office furniture, expensive legal consultations, equipment and supplies that were never delivered to common areas. Karen had been using her position to embezzle community funds for personal use and unauthorized projects. I spent the next evening at my computer, cross-referencing the financial records with HOA meeting minutes and community improvement reports. The evidence was undeniable. Karen had been systematically stealing from the community while using her fabricated authority to silence potential critics. My phone rang late that night. The caller ID showed Karen's name. "David, this is your final warning. If those excess vehicles are not removed from your property by tomorrow morning, the HOA will begin immediate legal proceedings against you. I have already contacted our attorney, and we are prepared to file for injunctive relief and financial penalties." Her voice was cold and threatening, but I could hear something else underneath: desperation. She was escalating because she sensed that her control was slipping. "Karen, I have some concerns about the validity of this regulation that I would like to discuss with you and the board. Could we schedule a meeting to review the documentation?" She laughed bitterly. "There is nothing to discuss. You will comply with HOA regulations, or you will face the consequences. The board has already voted to take aggressive action against non-compliant residents." I knew she was lying. There was no board. There had been no vote. She was operating as a dictator, making threats she had no authority to carry out. "I would like to attend the next board meeting to address these concerns directly," I said calmly. "The next meeting is Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. But do not think that showing up will change anything. The board supports my decisions completely." After she hung up, I sat in my garage surrounded by my classic cars, reviewing the evidence I had gathered: financial records, invalid elections, fabricated regulations, harassment of multiple residents. Karen had built her little empire on lies and intimidation. She had no idea that her Thursday meeting was about to become the most important event in the history of our community. She had no idea that I was about to bring documentation that would expose everything she had been doing. Most importantly, she had no idea that I was about to reveal a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about power and authority in our neighborhood. The breakthrough came at the most unexpected moment. I was at the courthouse again, this time diving deeper into the historical property records to understand the community's original development structure. I wanted to trace the legal foundation of the HOA itself, to understand how Karen had been able to manipulate the system so effectively. The county clerk, a helpful woman named Sandra, had been assisting me with accessing older records that were stored in archived filing systems. We had been working together for several hours when she pulled out a thick folder of documents from the 1980s. "This is the original subdivision filing for your community," she said, setting the folder on the table. "These documents show the initial development permits, land ownership transfers, and legal structures that were established when the neighborhood was first built. I opened the folder and began reading through pages of legal documents, property surveys, and development agreements. The language was dense and technical, but I was determined to understand every detail of how our community had been legally established. That is when I saw it. A name that stopped my heart and changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. The original developer and property owner was listed as Harrison Properties, LLC. The principal owner and signatory on all documents was listed as Robert Harrison. Robert Harrison was my grandfather's name. My hands began shaking as I read through the documents more carefully. The legal structure was complex, involving multiple corporations and trust arrangements, but the pattern was clear. My grandfather had been the original developer of the entire community. Every house, every street, every common area. I had inherited this property through a family trust that I had never fully understood. My grandfather had died when I was in college, leaving me a substantial inheritance that I had always assumed came from his successful business ventures. The inheritance had been managed through a complex trust structure that provided me with quarterly distributions and eventual ownership of various assets. I had never realized that one of those assets was the land underneath every house in my neighborhood. "Sandra," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to understand something about property ownership transfers. If the original developer retained ownership through a trust structure, and that trust was inherited by family members, what would that mean for the current residents?" Sandra looked at the documents more carefully. "Well, if the trust retained ownership of the underlying land, then the current residents would likely have long-term lease agreements rather than actual ownership. The trust would still be the legal owner of the property, and the residents would have contractual rights to occupy their homes." My mind was racing. And what would that mean for a homeowners association? Would they have any legal authority over property they do not actually own? Her eyes widened as she began to understand the implications. Oh my! If the HOA was established based on the assumption that residents own their properties, but the land is actually owned by a trust, then the HOA would have no legal authority whatsoever. They would be operating as a completely unauthorized organization. I needed to contact my family's estate attorney immediately. The law office of Peterson, Martinez and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown office building. I had been there several times over the years for trust-related paperwork, but I had never paid much attention to the details of my inheritance structure. Margaret Peterson, the senior partner who had handled my family's legal affairs for decades, greeted me with the warm smile of someone who had watched me grow up. "David, what a pleasant surprise. How can I help you today?" I spread the county property records across her conference table. "Margaret, I need to understand something about my inheritance from my grandfather. I just discovered that he was the original developer of my neighborhood, and I need to know what that means for my current legal standing." Margaret examined the documents carefully, occasionally referring to files from her own cabinets. After nearly an hour of review, she looked up at me with an expression of amazement. "David, you own that entire community. The land, the streets, the common areas, everything. Your grandfather established the development through a complex trust structure that was designed to minimize tax liability while retaining ownership. When he died, ownership transferred to you through the family trust." I felt like the room was spinning. But what about the HOA? What about the residents who think they own their homes? Margaret smiled knowingly. The residents have long-term lease agreements that are structured to look like traditional home ownership. They pay monthly fees that they believe are HOA dues, but they are actually lease payments to the trust. The HOA has no legal authority because they do not own the property they claim to govern. She pulled out a thick folder of documents. Your grandfather was very careful about this structure. He wanted to maintain control over the community's development and standards while allowing residents to feel like traditional homeowners. The system has been operating smoothly for decades because no one has ever challenged the authority structure. I stared at the documents in disbelief. So when Corinne claims to have HOA authority over my property, she is actually making threats against the person who owns the land her house sits on. Margaret nodded. Exactly. She has been collecting fees, making rules, and threatening legal action against the actual owner of the property. From a legal standpoint, she has been operating without any authority whatsoever. I thought about Corinne's threatening phone calls, her harassment of other residents, and her embezzlement of community funds. She had been running an elaborate scam, using fabricated authority to control and intimidate people who had no idea they were actually tenants rather than owners. Margaret, I need to understand my options. If I choose to exercise my ownership rights, what would that mean for the community? She leaned back in her chair. You have complete authority over the property. You can establish whatever rules and management structure you believe is appropriate. You can evict residents who violate their lease agreements. You can dissolve the HOA entirely and establish direct management of the community. The implications were staggering. Corinne had been threatening legal action against someone who had the power to evict her from her home. She had been stealing money from someone who could shut down her entire operation with a single phone call. What about the Thursday meeting that Corinne has scheduled? I asked. Margaret smiled. I think that meeting is going to be very educational for everyone involved. Would you like me to prepare some documentation to support your revelation? That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by my 5 classic cars, reviewing the legal documents that proved I owned every inch of the community Corinne claimed to control. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. She had picked a fight with the one person who had the power to end her harassment campaign permanently. She had no idea that her Thursday meeting was about to become the most important event in the history of our community. Most importantly, she had no idea that she was about to face someone who held all the cards and had been quietly building an unassailable case against her corruption and abuse of power. The next morning, Margaret Peterson's office became a war room. We spread documents across 2 conference tables, organizing evidence into categories that would support my revelation and protect me from any potential legal challenges Corinne might attempt. The key, Margaret explained, is to present this information in a way that is clear, irrefutable, and legally sound. Corinne has been operating under the assumption that she holds legitimate authority. When that assumption is challenged, she will likely become desperate and potentially dangerous. We prepared 3 sets of documentation. The first set proved my ownership of the entire community through the family trust. Original development records, trust documents, and property transfer agreements that established my grandfather as the developer and me as the current owner. The second set documented Corinne's unauthorized activities, the invalid election process that had given her the position of HOA president, the fabricated regulations she had been enforcing, the harassment campaigns against multiple residents, the embezzlement of community funds for personal use. The third set established the legal framework for moving forward, lease agreements that residents had been signing without realizing they were tenants rather than owners, authority structures that I could implement to provide legitimate community management, options for dealing with Karen's misconduct. I recommend that we prepare formal cease and desist orders for Karen's harassment activities, Margaret said. We should also prepare documentation that dissolves the HOA structure and establishes your direct authority over community management. I was amazed by the scope of Karen's deception. She had been collecting monthly fees from residents, claiming they were HOA dues, when they were actually lease payments to my family trust. She had been using her fabricated authority to terrorize people who were paying rent to me. What about the other residents? I asked. They have been living under the assumption that they own their homes. How do we handle that situation? Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Most of them have been operating under long-term lease agreements that are structured to feel like traditional homeownership. They have equity in their homes, property tax responsibilities, and most of the benefits of ownership. The legal structure is different, but their practical situation does not have to change dramatically. That afternoon, I met with the group of residents who had been sharing their stories of harassment by Karen. Robert Chen, Mrs. Williams, the Martinez family, and several others gathered at the coffee shop where we had been meeting secretly. I have some news that is going to change everything, I told them. But I need to ask for your patience and support as we navigate this situation together. I explained the ownership structure that I had discovered, being careful to emphasize that their living situations and property rights were not in jeopardy. What was changing was the authority structure that Karen had been abusing. Mrs. Williams was the first to speak. So you are telling us that Karen has been collecting fees and making rules without any legal authority to do so? That is correct, I replied. She has been operating a completely unauthorized organization while embezzling funds that belong to the community. Robert Chen shook his head in amazement. No wonder she has been so resistant to questions about her decision-making process. She has been making it up as she goes along. The Martinez family looked relieved. Does this mean we can put our children's play equipment back in our yard without fear of fines? I smiled. It means that reasonable people can work together to establish community standards that make sense for everyone. No more arbitrary rules imposed by someone with no authority to make them. We spent the next hour discussing how to handle Thursday's meeting. I wanted to give Karen every opportunity to respond to the evidence and potentially resign gracefully. But I also wanted to be prepared for the possibility that she would react poorly to having her authority challenged. The most important thing, I told the group, is that we approach this situation with dignity and respect for everyone in the community. Karen has been wrong about her methods, but our response should demonstrate the kind of leadership and fairness that we want to see moving forward. That evening, I worked with Margaret to prepare my presentation for the Thursday meeting. We organized the evidence into a clear, logical sequence that would be easy for residents to understand. Property ownership documents, trust agreements, evidence of Karen's unauthorized activities, financial records showing the embezzlement of community funds. Remember, Margaret said, Karen is going to be shocked and likely very angry when she realizes what is happening. She has built her entire identity around the authority she believes she holds. When that authority is revealed to be completely fabricated, she may react unpredictably. I spent Wednesday evening in my garage, surrounded by my 5 classic cars, reviewing my presentation materials one final time. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Corinne had started this entire conflict by claiming I had too many cars in my garage. She had no idea that she was about to discover I owned the garage, the driveway, the house, and every other piece of property in the community. My phone rang around 10 o'clock. The caller ID showed Corinne's name. David, I am calling to inform you that tomorrow's meeting will include a community vote on your continued residence in our neighborhood. The board has reviewed your noncompliance with HOA regulations, and we believe that removal may be necessary to maintain community standards. Her voice was cold and threatening, but I could hear the desperation underneath. She was escalating because she sensed that her control was slipping, but she had no idea how completely her world was about to change. Corinne, I will be at the meeting tomorrow evening. I have some information that I believe will be very relevant to the discussion. She laughed bitterly. Nothing you say tomorrow will change the fact that you have refused to comply with legitimate HOA authority. The community has had enough of your disruptive behavior. After she hung up, I sat in the quiet garage, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Corinne's harassment had awakened something in me that I had not felt in years, a sense of justice, a determination to fight back against corruption and abuse of power. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be the most important event in the history of our community. Corinne had no idea that she was about to face someone who held all the cards and had been quietly building an unassailable case against her corruption. The classic cars around me seemed to glow in the soft garage lighting, beautiful reminders of American craftsmanship and engineering excellence. Tomorrow, they would no longer be the source of conflict. Tomorrow, they would become symbols of justice served and truth revealed. The community center was packed when I arrived Thursday evening. Word had spread about the meeting, and it seemed like every resident in the neighborhood had come to witness what Corinne was calling a decisive moment for our community standards. I took a seat in the back row, carrying a briefcase filled with legal documents and evidence. Margaret Peterson sat beside me, ready to provide legal support if Corinne attempted to challenge the legitimacy of my claims. Corinne stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, looking more official and authoritative than I had ever seen her. She had prepared presentation materials, printed handouts, and what appeared to be a formal agenda for the meeting. "Good evening, everyone," Corinne began, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. "Thank you all for coming to this important community meeting. Tonight, we are going to address a serious threat to our neighborhood standards and property values." She gestured dramatically toward the back of the room where I was sitting. "David has repeatedly refused to comply with legitimate HOA regulations regarding excessive vehicle storage. Despite multiple warnings and official violation notices, he continues to operate his property as if he is above the rules that govern our community." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Corinne had clearly spent considerable time preparing public opinion against me, and many residents seemed to believe that I was indeed the problem. "The HOA board has reviewed this situation extensively," Corinne continued, "and we have determined that David's continued noncompliance represents a threat to community standards that requires immediate action." She held up a prepared document. "Tonight, we are going to vote on a resolution that will require David to either comply with HOA regulations immediately or face removal from our community. This is not a decision we make lightly, but it is necessary to protect the values and standards that we all cherish." The room erupted in supportive applause. Corinne smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had complete control over the situation. Before we proceed with the vote, Karen announced, I want to give David an opportunity to address the community. Perhaps he would like to apologize for his disruptive behavior and commit to following the rules like everyone else. All eyes turned to me as I stood up slowly. I could feel the hostility in the room, the sense that I was about to be judged and found wanting by my own neighbors. Thank you, Karen, I said, walking toward the front of the room with my briefcase. I do have some things I would like to share with the community tonight. I set my briefcase on the table and began removing documents. Before we discuss vehicle storage regulations, I think it would be helpful to review the legal foundation of the HOA itself. Karen's smile faltered slightly. The legal foundation is not relevant to this discussion. We are here to address your noncompliance with established regulations. I held up the first set of documents. These are the original development records for our community, filed with the county when the neighborhood was first built in the 1980s. They show the legal structure that was established by the original developer. I could see confusion spreading across faces in the audience. This was not the direction they had expected the meeting to take. The original developer was Harrison Properties, LLC, I continued. The principal owner was Robert Harrison, who established this community through a complex trust structure designed to maintain ownership while providing residents with long-term occupancy rights. Karen stepped forward aggressively. This is completely irrelevant to the issue at hand. You are trying to distract from your noncompliance with a bunch of meaningless legal paperwork. I looked directly at her. Robert Harrison was my grandfather. When he died, ownership of this entire community transferred to me through the family trust. The room went completely silent. I could see the color draining from Karen's face as she began to understand the implications of what I was saying. These documents, I said, holding up the trust agreements, show that I am the legal owner of every piece of property in this community. The land your houses sit on, the streets, the common areas, everything. Karen's voice was shaking. That is impossible. We all own our homes. We have deeds and mortgages and property tax bills. Margaret Peterson stood up from her seat in the back. The residents have long-term lease agreements that are structured to provide most of the benefits of traditional homeownership. But the underlying land ownership has always remained with the Harrison Family Trust. I held up the next set of documents. This means that the HOA has never had any legal authority over this property. You have been collecting fees, making rules, and threatening legal action against the actual owner of the land you claim to govern. Karen was now visibly panicking. This is some kind of fraud. These documents are forgeries. You are trying to scam the entire community with fake legal papers. But I was not finished. I held up the financial records that Mrs. Williams had helped me compile. These documents show that you have been embezzling community funds for personal use. Thousands of dollars in fees that residents believed were going toward community maintenance have been spent on unauthorized personal expenses. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. Residents began looking at each other with confusion and growing anger as they realized the scope of what had been happening. You have been operating without any legal authority, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. You have been harassing residents, making up regulations, and stealing community funds while claiming to represent an organization that has no legitimate basis for existence. Karen's face had gone from pale to bright red. You cannot do this. I am the HOA president. I was elected by this community. I have the authority to enforce community standards. I held up the election records. You were appointed by 3 people in a closed meeting that violated every requirement of the original HOA bylaws. Your election was completely invalid. You have been operating as a self-appointed dictator with no legal standing whatsoever. Margaret Peterson stepped forward. As Mr. Harrison's attorney, I can confirm that all of these documents are legitimate and legally binding. Karen has been collecting fees and making threats against the actual property owner while embezzling funds that belong to the community. The room was now in complete chaos. Residents were shouting questions, demanding explanations, and expressing outrage at having been deceived for so long. Karen stood at the front of the room, her clipboard clutched to her chest, looking like someone whose entire world had just collapsed. "This meeting is over," Karen announced desperately. "I am not going to stand here and listen to these lies and accusations." "Actually," I said calmly, "this meeting is just beginning. As the property owner, I am dissolving the unauthorized HOA structure that you have been operating. Effective immediately, all of your claimed authority is terminated." Karen's eyes were wild with panic and rage. "You cannot do this. We have lawyers, we have contracts, we have legal standing." Margaret Peterson smiled. "No, you do not. You have been operating a completely fraudulent organization. Your only options now are to cooperate with the transition to legitimate community management or face potential criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud." I looked out at the stunned faces of my neighbors. "I want everyone to know that your living situations are not in jeopardy. Your lease agreements provide you with long-term occupancy rights and most of the benefits of traditional homeownership. What is changing is the management structure that has been abusing your trust and stealing your money." Robert Chen stood up from his seat. "So what happens now? How do we move forward from this?" I had been preparing for this question. We establish a legitimate community management structure with proper oversight and accountability. We recover the funds that have been embezzled, and we create reasonable community standards that are developed through genuine input from residents rather than the arbitrary demands of a self-appointed dictator. Karen made one final desperate attempt to maintain control. "Even if these documents are real, the community voted to support my leadership. These people trust me to make decisions that protect their property values." Mrs. Williams stood up and addressed the room. "Karen has been lying to us for years. She has been stealing our money and making up rules to harass anyone who questioned her authority. I have seen the financial records. I have seen the evidence of her corruption." The room erupted in angry voices directed at Karen. Residents who had been supporting her moments earlier were now demanding answers about the missing funds and unauthorized activities. Karen grabbed her materials and headed for the door. "This is not over. I will fight this in court. I will not let you destroy everything I have built for this community." As she reached the exit, I called out one final statement that I had been saving for this moment. "Karen, you might want to remember that as the property owner, I have the authority to terminate lease agreements for residents who engage in fraud or harassment of other community members." She stopped in the doorway, her hand frozen on the handle. The implication was clear. If she chose to fight this revelation in court, she could lose her home as well as her fabricated authority. Karen left the meeting without another word, and I spent the next 2 hours answering questions from residents who were trying to understand how they had been deceived for so long. The most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Martinez asked, "So David can keep his classic cars in his garage without any interference?" I smiled. "Not only can I keep my cars, but I am thinking about organizing community car shows so everyone can enjoy these pieces of automotive history." The room filled with laughter and applause. The nightmare of Karen's authoritarian rule was finally over. Karen resigned from all her fabricated positions the next morning through a brief email that contained no apology and no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She simply stated that she was stepping down from community leadership due to personal reasons. Within a week, she had put her house up for sale and moved out of the community entirely. The for sale sign in her front yard felt like a symbol of justice finally served. The community rallied together in ways that I had never imagined possible. Residents who had been intimidated by Karen's harassment came forward with stories of her abuse and offers to help establish legitimate community management. We formed committees to address real issues like road maintenance, common area upkeep, and reasonable community standards. The embezzled funds were recovered through Margaret Peterson's legal action. Karen was required to repay everything she had stolen, plus penalties and legal fees. The money was returned to the community and used for actual improvements rather than Karen's personal expenses. Most importantly, we established a transparent management structure where decisions were made through genuine community input rather than the arbitrary demands of a self-appointed dictator. Residents had real voices in the policies that affected their lives. My classic car collection became a source of community pride rather than conflict. We organized monthly car shows where neighbors could bring their own vehicles and share stories about automotive history and restoration projects. Children learned about American craftsmanship, while adults enjoyed the social connections that had been impossible under Karen's regime of fear and intimidation. The garage that had started this entire conflict became a gathering place where residents could work on projects, share tools, and build the kind of community relationships that Karen had been destroying with her authoritarian approach. 6 months later, as I stood in my driveway polishing my 1967 Mustang Fastback, Mrs. Peterson walked over with a smile. "You know," she said, "this is the first time in years that I have actually enjoyed living in this neighborhood." I looked around at children playing in yards without fear of arbitrary fines, gardens growing without threats of violation notices, and neighbors talking to each other instead of worrying about HOA harassment. "It turns out," I replied, "that when reasonable people work together, we can create the kind of community we all want to live in." The 5 classic cars in my garage were no longer symbols of conflict. They had become symbols of standing up to corruption, fighting for justice, and proving that truth ultimately prevails over deception and abuse of power. Karen had picked the wrong fight with the wrong person. She had learned the hard way that threatening someone requires understanding who you are actually threatening.